Good evening, this is woodblock printmaker David Ball speaking to you here from our building in the Asakusa district of Tokyo. This video is going to be different from pretty much everything else on our channel. It has absolutely nothing to do with our usual topic of traditional Japanese woodblock prints. If it's more of that print beauty you are looking for, then perhaps you should skip this one. I've been living in Tokyo for well over 30 years, moving here from my previous home in Canada back in the summer of 1986. At the time I made that move, I had no idea that I would end up settling here for what seems to be turning out to be the rest of my life. I had only a 90-day tourist visa. That got extended and extended on and on until after about 7 years I applied for and received permanent resident status. I did that because during those early years in this country, I had found Japan to be a very congenial place to live. It wasn't that I didn't like Canada. I have many fond memories of my life there, but I really felt that I fit in here. I'm not Japanese and never will be, of course, but it's just that the basic structures of society here, the rights, responsibilities, the patterns of life, they all seem to fit something in my character. I like it here, and I think I contribute well to the society. But living in Japan, it's not the topic of this presentation. It's something else. I said I like it here in preference to my previous life in Canada, but there is something that I had back there that I really, and I mean really, miss here. And I don't mean the muffins, although let's not get into that just now. What I miss here is chances to solve all the problems of the universe, if I can put it that way. Let me explain what I mean. When I was living back there, at least a couple of times a week, I would have a chance to get together with friends in the evening. Perhaps friend Terry, who at that time was single, he would join our family for dinner. Perhaps when I was single, actually, I was over at Greg's place for a game of chess while he played a new LP he thought I would like. Perhaps it was a group of fellow students from the college where my wife was studying who came over for a potluck dinner. Now, these meetups didn't happen every day, of course, but a couple of times a week at least. We mixed and we ate and we talked. The food or the chess or the music, it was just an accompaniment to conversation. Interesting conversation. Now, surely people here in Japan do this too, don't they? Isn't there a huge evening scene here, bars and restaurants? Well, bars and restaurants there are, but there is a massive difference between these two cultures in how people interact with each other. First, most of our gatherings back in Canada, they were at somebody's home. It was casual, arranged on the spur of the moment, cost basically nothing, and was happening in a very comfortable and congenial environment, somebody's living room. Here in Japan, you never, and I mean never, enter somebody else's home. Two people can be best friends for decades and would never set foot in each other's home. It's just not part of the culture. For example, I've lived next door to Ishida-san for over 20 years. I've never been past his front door and never expect to. You want to meet somebody? You schedule it. Organize it, arrange a place, pay the money, sit at a table, jam next to another table all the time, watching the clock because you can't miss your train home, the train jam-packed even late in the evening. A fun evening get-together? No fun. No thanks. But that's only part of the problem. The bigger issue is that even when you do get a chance to meet up with friends or co-workers, the permitted interactions are extremely limited. It's partly cultural rules, it's partly the structure of the language itself, but a really free interchange and expression of ideas, it's just next to impossible when speaking Japanese. In English, for example, when having a discussion about something, you're quite free to express ideas confidently and firmly. The other person understands that you have a certain feeling or belief about something, and they listen to what you say. They may agree, they may totally disagree, and if so, they will tell you why. But a fundamental ground rule is that people accept that you will express ideas. Here in Japan, I guess it's partly because of the overwhelming desire for consensus. It's simply not acceptable behavior to express your own ideas strongly and firmly. When you do this, it's taken as criticism or even hostility towards the thoughts and feelings of others. Over in Canada, in the thick of an interesting discussion, you can bang your beer down on the table, wave your finger, really try and make your point vigorously. You get the idea, and people will respond in kind. Try that here, and you will just shut the whole thing down. Overly vigorous expression of your own ideas, that's with or without finger wagging, it's taken as condemnation of their ideas. You are trying to dominate, and that's not how it plays here. Now, as a result of these cultural differences, very few people here are even capable of taking part in the kind of discussion that I'm describing. Even when they know they're speaking to a foreigner who they think plays by different rules anyway. They just don't have the years of practice that we have. Practice at developing one's thoughts in such a way that you can present your ideas to other people. Now, anybody who has good knowledge of Japan and its culture, they're just nodding along as I say this. They're going to say to me, Dave, why are you complaining about this? You just finished telling us you like Japan. You have chosen to live in Japan. So, live with this. And I get it. Yes, I fully understand that that's how it is here. And I'm not actually complaining. Although I guess I'm complaining. What can you do? Anyway, to get to the point, I was simply trying to express the idea that I myself very much miss that kind of discussion. Debate, if you will. Trying to, as I said, solve all the problems of the universe. It's not just that while involved in discussion you can learn from other people's ideas, it's that you're forced to clarify your own thoughts. If your thinking is fuzzy or vague, or your ideas are half-baked to start with, those friends of yours will shoot you down right away. It's through this kind of back and forth, the probing, the testing of your ideas, it's through these kind of discussions that thoughts really start to come into focus. So, perhaps you get now what today's presentation is about. I've been frustrated at having no outlet for good discussions of rich and deep topics. So what's a guide to do? Well, at least I can present my side of such a discussion. I can put down my thoughts on a nice, rich topic. What topic? Well, I guess you've already seen from the title of this video. I have some thoughts to put forward on the meanings of life. Nothing like, starting small and working your way up. No, but really, why that topic? It goes back a few years to a discussion I had with one of my daughters and her husband one evening during a visit to Canada, wouldn't you know. There was perhaps some wine on the table, and we were enjoying the get-together and the conversation. At some point along the way, I honestly don't remember how it all got started, the question of the meaning of life had come up. Given that the two of them are young, and I am less so, it kind of fell to me to be the one to explain this, to provide the answer. Now, there was no recorder on the table, of course, so I have no idea exactly what I did say that evening, but I do remember later on thinking something like, gee, that kind of came out well. Maybe, and I guess I'd giggle to myself at this point, maybe my thinking on this topic might not be too far off the mark. Have I perhaps got this figured out? As I said, this took place a few years ago, but since then I've occasionally come back to this in my mind, trying to clarify my thoughts on this question, these questions. Why are we here? Are we alone in the universe? What will happen when I die? And that big one, what is the meaning of life? Now, I'm not a trained philosopher or a life scientist. I'm just a simple woodblock printmaker. But I don't think you need official training to ponder these things. These questions are for everybody. And if you, perhaps, have also thought about these things at some point, then this little presentation might be of interest to you. It seems to me that I can answer these questions quite clearly and with very little uncertainty or confusion. Whether or not you will agree is, of course, another matter. Anyway, if you're game for it, let's have a go. Let's start by breaking the thing into manageable parts. Any discussion of the meaning of life has to take place at two vastly different levels. Life as a general concept, as in living things in the universe and on this planet. Why is there such a thing as life? And life for the individual. What is the meaning of life for me and for you? Let's deal with them separately. The big picture first, then after we clear that one up, we tackle the second one. So, why is there such a thing as life, and how did it get started? And when real scientists are talking about this topic, they are hamstrung by a lack of evidence. So far, we have only one life-bearing planet to study. Because of the way science works, having only a single sample severely limits the conclusions they're allowed to draw. We see life here, so life exists on every planet and body is not something they can sensibly conclude. And indeed, as we have now begun to visit and collect bits of data from other planets and bodies in this solar system and have come up empty-handed, a possible conclusion might be the reverse. It's rare for life to exist on planets and bodies. But it is here. So that forces us to try and differentiate our planet from the other bodies we have visited so far. And one major difference immediately jumps to mind. Our planet is active and fluid and has life. The other places we have visited or observed are inactive and quiet and don't seem to harbor life. This fluidity of our planetary environment hugely differentiates it from those other places. This is a very active place in which nothing seems to stay the same for too long. I'm speaking about geological timescales here. Heat energy from inside the planet, it maintains a liquid layer over which continents slide around, rearranging themselves into new shapes and structures. That energy from below builds new lands, while older land is subsumed back into the inner depths to be melted and reformed. Now, all the time that that's going on, there is external energy pouring down onto the planet, and that's also variable on daily schedules, seasonal schedules, and geological schedules. The flow of all this energy as it tries to level itself out between the hot and cold places, this flow moves stuff around. And it does so in a very interesting way. Things are always the same and things are always different. Let me explain what I mean. I'll tell you a story about one summer day many years ago. My brother and I, we were little boys, and our family had gone to a beach or perhaps a lake someplace. There was some kind of stream flowing down towards the main body of water. And he and I had a great time damming it up and forcing it to flow down across a fresh, clear, sandy area. Now, as the water made its way forward, it began to cut a new channel, and the two of us had a great time playing with this, putting stones and bits of wood in its path, forcing the water into diversions and in different directions. The water flowed in different ways as it encountered variations along the way, widening out here, and narrowing and deepening there. Now, he and I only played there for that one afternoon, but imagine a thought experiment here. Imagine that the next day, another two boys came to the same place and did much the same thing. And then the next day, and the next, again and again. Those rivers in the sand, the ones created anew each day, how would they compare? Well, they would be absolutely the same in overall appearance. I mean, given the presence of that amount of water flow over sand of such and such a consistency, we would see the same basic thing happening. But would these rivers have the same curve to the left here, the same depth over here? No, of course not. There would be absolutely no chance of them being identical in that sense. The vast majority of our rivers will look alike, right in what must be a bell curve of river dynamics, with perhaps a few outliers on each side, where some particular local phenomenon, maybe there was a piece of hard soil somewhere, it affected the shape of the finished river in a major way. They're always the same and always different. What I'm trying to emphasize here is this, that although every single detail of every single one of our little rivers is unpredictable, the overall object is totally predictable. And indeed, given the starting circumstances in the real world, ground being lifted up by that planetary internal energy, rainfall coming from that solar energy, the end result is inevitable. It will happen. Rivers will happen. And they will all look like rivers. No scientist will ask, Why are there rivers on this planet? Are there rivers on other planets out there? What is the meaning of a river? Given the right starting setup, that batch of dust and rocks gathering around the sun in the early days of our solar system, the eventual presence of rivers was ordained by the laws of physics. They come into being, inevitably, no mystery. I've talked about rivers, but of course this applies to all other aspects of that whirling cloud of dust and rocks around our early sun that began to bang together and gradually congeal into something that would bit by bit come to look like a planet. Everything was directed by the basic laws of physics, completely inflexible laws guiding the entire process from raw beginnings to the kind of environment we see around us today. A certain amount of stuff in a certain environment ended up as this thing we now call our Earth. Now we get to the meat of this discussion, the emergence of life. This is a step that scientists don't have a clear understanding of, but that's because they're severely hampered in their research by the subsequent billions of years of planetary stirring that followed the initial stages of life's development. The same energetic environment that provided the impetus has also covered up all traces of the early steps. We can sort of reverse engineer the process that led to the formation of the planet itself, but it's very doubtful that we would ever be able to reverse engineer any current cellular structure back to the point where we can see how it got started. But we can try and work out how it could have happened, based on basic principles of the sort I have discussed so far. When I was younger, a popular theory for the origin of life on Earth was that lightning would strike into a kind of primeval soup mix of organic molecules, shocking some of them into complex forms. But I can't see that as a likely way of life getting started. It seems to me that the violence involved in such a process would be inimical to the formation of structures that are complex yet stable enough to survive. I think it much more likely that it was a very slow and extremely incremental process. To provide the kind of inevitability that is required to give this a chance of happening, we shouldn't be looking at once in a zillion chance types of events. We need to postulate a process that is made up of very simple steps, each and every one of which just takes place as a matter of course when ingredients and energy are present, just as we saw with the rivers and with the solar system and planet itself. So let's change that around. Instead of theorizing that the energy is used to form a new structure directly, the lightning strike creating a complex amino acid, let's think of the energy coming into the system as simply adding energy, stirring, shaking, mixing, lifting. Think of the energy as the hand on one of those old-fashioned pinboard machines. It launches the balls flying to the top of the board, where they then proceed to lose that energy as they fall back down, banging onto pins here and there, mindlessly and randomly following the basic laws of physics. But, wow, forming interesting patterns in the slots at the bottom of the pinboard. But were there slots waiting on our young planet? Well, the answer to that is possibly yes. One theory out there that seems really interesting to me proposes that mineral lattices, something very common in nature, could have acted as frameworks for molecular structures to form. It could begin in an extremely simple way, just some exposed clay surface in an environment containing a varied selection of simple molecules. It's like the classic shallow warm sea, if you like. This environment is constantly stirred and disrupted by the energy in the system, from solar radiation, tidal forces. Sure, throw in some lightning if you want. One can easily imagine stirred up molecules settling one by one into some kind of lattice on the clay, where they become linked together. Perhaps they dislodge from the clay, perhaps it dissolves from around them, leaving them free to float away, probably to instantly become broken up and dissolved. Repeat. Repeat. Repeat in every random arrangement of whatever molecules are present, being constantly stirred up and mixed by the energy coming into the system. It's an ongoing process that happens as a matter of course, as an artifact of the physical properties of the objects involved, not a single special one-off event. The makeup of the mix of molecules changes over time due to the constant energetic destruction and rearrangement of the environment. Okay, perhaps some of these floating chains of molecules survive long enough to meet with an environment of compatible molecules, which settle and connect themselves into places along the chain in a rudimentary form of the way that our own DNA these days, it replicates by splitting and picking up molecules floating in the surrounding cellular soup. Presumably, these molecules would instantly be broken up and dissolved by those same energetic forces that help bring them into existence. But it's not too much of a stretch to think that with this kind of a process going on ad infinitum, that at some point a particular structure is formed that has enough structural strength to survive for some seconds, minutes, days, that it splits into pieces, each of which then collects more molecules, that now and again a slightly different molecule gets into the mix by transcription error, either to be quickly destroyed because the linkage is weaker, or perhaps to be transferred to the next iteration if it were a tad stronger. This is replication with variation. And this is the point where Mr. Darwin enters the room and we are up and running. Now, look, I'm a woodblock printmaker, not an organic chemist. And I'm sure those people are for sure laughing at me now, if any of them have made it this far. Perhaps that clay framework hypothesis has been shown to be not practical. The particular example is irrelevant. The point which I'm trying to propose is that we need to take as an obvious starting idea for this the concept that the formation of life here on this planet, distant planets, anywhere, it happens no differently than any of the other multitude of processes taking place. Everything from shaping the river, making and destroying mountains, forming hurricanes, sorting out the components of the young solar system. You name it. Ingredients present? Check. Energy present? Check. Then just stand back and watch. What will happen will be absolutely inevitable and entirely predictable. Always the same, and of course, always different. This leads to a hugely interesting point. If that process of the creation of life is so fundamental and basic and just happens naturally given a suitable mix, then why isn't it still going on? After all, our current environment on this planet still fits the recipe. Lots of ingredients, lots of energy flowing around. So where are all the different resulting life forms? Well, the answer is obvious. The same kind of process is going on right here under our noses all the time. These days, though, any such rudimentary molecular chains, the ones that don't break up naturally, get eaten. Winner takes all when it comes to the emergence of life. Now, of course, it wasn't inevitable that Homo sapiens would appear, that David Bull would appear. I hope everybody understands the way that I'm using this word inevitable. As I said, rivers as a concept are inevitable, but any exact river shape will never happen twice. Life forms as a concept are inevitable. The exact shapes and patterns are not. Although, just as with the rivers, there will be a range of very common similar types. So there's no mystery at all about the presence of life. We, you and me, and all of the rest of the creatures on this planet, vast to microscopic, we are simply a thing that automatically forms on the surface of an energetic planet as a natural outcome of the laws of physics. It would be strange if we weren't here. This thing we call life is just another manifestation of the flow of energy between the hottest spots, the suns, and the coldest spots, the interstellar void. Along the way on its journey from one stage to the other, the flow of energy causes many interesting things to happen, one of which is me, and one of which is you. The universe out there must be full of life. But, there's always a but, isn't there? There's an inherent paradox present in the very existence of life. I proposed that the development of life only became possible in an environment that was active and turbulent. In a static environment with little exchange of energy and little change, life would not come to exist. But the active and turbulent environment carries with it the danger of change. Not just danger, the promise of change. Now, change itself within a reasonable amount, say the level that would normally be encountered on a planetary surface with weather, climate change, volcanoes, earthquake, continental drift all going on. This kind of change is no problem at all for the existence of life. Life as a whole takes all this in stride. And indeed, vigorous environmental activity will simply, encourage life into different shapes and forms that will be more closely suited to the new environment that is coming along. Given such turbulence, though, individual organisms might at any moment suddenly find things tough going. And with greater turbulence, individual species will be in the same position. Energy giveth, and energy taketh away. So it seems to be inherent, built in from the very beginning, that no particular form of life can last all that long. And this matches exactly what we see, both in our current environment and in what we understand of the planet's history at every level. Everything comes and goes, and nothing persists beyond some kind of natural time frame set by the pace of change in the environment. Any individual flower, any particular species of flower, a mountain, a group of mountains, a continent, they come and they go. These things all have a cycle to their existence, a beginning and an end. It's completely obvious that our own culture, our civilization, our species will also pass. By what specific agent? It could be something external, like a giant asteroid. We know this happens because we've seen evidence of it here on our own planet. Or it could be something more directly related to activity right on the planetary surface. Perhaps it's already started to happen, a cycle of global climate change. Or perhaps it is yet millennia in the future. But to expect humans to be immune from this would be to deny all the reality we see around us everywhere. Far better just to believe it. Here today, gone tomorrow. And thinking about this kind of inevitability is the thing that gave me trouble when I was younger and first thinking about these issues. If we're all going to die anyway, we being the individual, the species, the planet, then why bother? What's the point? What's the meaning of it all? Am I really just another object, an inevitable and meaningless artifact of physical laws? Get born, live, replicate, maybe, die, surely. Get born, live, die. Is that all there is? Born through no wish of our own, exist for some length of time, die. Is that it? Really? Well, we'll see. Hit the pause button, go grab a cup of coffee or something, and let's take a look at that in part 2. When I put together the first part of this presentation, it seemed to me that the overall mood and feeling of the thing was positive. I put forward the idea that our existence on this planet isn't due to some spectacularly lucky chance event, and that life is probably ubiquitous in the universe, that it is a normal phenomenon that happens completely naturally as a consequence of basic physical laws, and that as such, it isn't something mysterious that can't be explained. But there was also undoubtedly a negative aspect to what I said, that any given species or individual within that species was nothing special, and that it was easy come, easy go, that we are born, we die, and that's that. So where does that leave us for this next part of my presentation, where we look at the meaning of life for the individual? Haven't I already decided that there is no meaning? Not at all. It's quite the reverse. Let's explore. To begin this second part of our investigations, let's imagine a distant observer hovering in space, looking down at our planet. What are some of the things such an observer might see in any given few minutes? Over here, a seed falls to the ground and a tree is born. Over there, a crack shows in an eggshell and a chick is born. Somewhere else, a sperm meets an ova and a human will soon be born. Each of these resulting life forms takes its place as an integral part of the stunningly complex web of life on the surface of this planet. We all understand what happens next. Each of these new lives will proceed to develop, consuming a share of the available energy supply, building itself as it goes along, processing materials from the environment, and emitting waste products, which in turn will provide resources for other life forms. It might live its entire life in a time of environmental stability. It might meet with disaster at any moment. At the end, when it no longer has the ability to replicate its own cells, it will die, and its component molecules will be released back into the environment. An environment that was ever so slightly transformed by the experience of that life having existed. Now that external observer watching all this take place, the life of that tree, of the chick, and of that human, would have no reason at all to try and find an individual and unique meaning in any one particular one of those lives. That observer, seeing the overall system, watches the ebb and flow of energy and activity everywhere, and he can thus understand the totality of the whole package. But down here on the ground, here I am living inside this body, a member of a species that has invented language, has invented the word meaning. To us, the question suddenly is relevant. I pinch myself. I'm here. What does it mean? And this brings us to one of the core points of the discussion, the question of the unexamined life. Is the unexamined life worth living, as the Socratic phrase has it? Socrates and other philosophers, because examining is all they do, they have their own built-in answer to that question. But what about the rest of us? I have a photo stored somewhere of a one-time very good friend of mine, Boots the cat. The photo is taken of her sleeping on a chair in the sunshine. Boots-chan's gone now. She came to the end of her natural life, I guess it was around 10 years ago. She was a wonderful companion for me. I have so many stories. Anyway, there she was on that day, fast asleep in the sunshine. Happy? You tell me. Eat a bit, socialize a bit, sleep a lot. For her, there seemed to be no problem with living an unexamined life. Now that was perhaps an unfair example. It's kind of cherry-picked. Staying with cats, though, as an example, what about one of the feral cats in the neighborhood out here? Filthy, disease-ridden, always hungry, trying to steal what scraps it can. That cat's life, nasty, brutish, and short, as the phrase goes, that life seems to be much less worth living than the one Boots-chan enjoyed. Did that cat enjoy her unexamined life? Now, we're told that we shouldn't overly anthropomorphize when talking about animals, but it's indeed difficult to avoid the sense that some lives seem better than others. Thinking back to Boots-chan, though, it's clear that she was only able to live such a stress-free life because of the infrastructure that surrounded her. She had a comfortable chair sheltered from the winter wind with a stocked food bowl always nearby. Where did that infrastructure come from? Well, I provided it, of course, but that kind of just pushes the question back a stage. Where did all my own wonderful infrastructure come from? My own comfortable chair, shelter from the cold, easy access to food. When you follow the chain of events back in time, it seems to me that such things, the objects and behaviors that make life better, came from the actions of individuals in our species who weren't satisfied with an unexamined life, but who kept asking questions. Why? How? What if? Gee, I'm hungry. Perhaps there's more food over there past those hills. Or, I'm so cold. What if we used this bearskin to cover the cave entrance? It was this kind of people, the ones who asked such questions, the ones who were unwilling to accept the status quo, it was those people who provided the motivation to get us to our present comfortable condition. Okay, coming back then to our theme of seeking meaning to our lives, it would seem that we might be near to an answer. Working towards a goal of improving the human condition would seem to qualify. At this point, you're probably thinking to yourself, Here we go. I know exactly where he's leading us with this chain of reasoning. He's going to end up feeding us the same kind of cliched stuff we hear in a university commencement talk. He's maybe going to talk about his own success first and then prescribe the typical meaningless nostrum. Find something, benefit humanity, follow your dream. But no, I don't actually believe in that. Benefit of humanity, follow your dream. This is no encouragement. When just tossed out at random, it can be a kind of constraint. We all have different skill sets and are certainly not all capable of creating and following some imaginary dream for the betterment of mankind. You will hear no such prescription from me. But okay, if I were standing there giving one of those commencement speeches, what would I say to the young graduates? If follow your dream is a constraint, then how would I encourage them? The reality is that not every one of us can strive to create wonderful things that make society better. Some of us just, live. What's the meaning in those lives? Well, we find that meaning when we are able to come to an understanding of our function in this society, how we fit into the gigantic network of life on this planet. The problem is kind of in our definitions, in how most of us tend to frame who we are. When I was a little kid, I was asked, it seems to me now to have been again and again, I was asked the seemingly innocuous question, what do you want to be when you grow up? Now, the adults who asked this were probably not always so serious about it. They were perhaps just making conversation. But sometimes the question was serious. And they were trying to encourage me to make sure that I could come up with an answer. They were in essence saying to me, get going, boy. There's a huge menu out there of careers to select from. Choose one. Decide what you want to be. I would be something. I would be a teacher or a fireman or a pilot, which is, I think, something I seem to remember actually answering to that question at some early stage of life. Anyway, the point I'm getting to is that the assumption in the air inherent in all our social systems, and of course our education system, is that we are going to be defined by our jobs. You know how it is when we first meet somebody, the conversation, nice to meet you, inevitably followed by a, what do you do? I'm a printmaker, I make woodblock prints. Oh, how interesting, and the conversation goes on from there. Now let's freeze that idea there for just a second. I am indeed a printmaker. You are something else. So what's wrong with defining ourselves that way? What's wrong is that it ignores so much else that goes on in our lives. It ignores so many other interactions vital to the part that we play in this society, implies a very narrow view of ourselves. And worst of all, what if we happen to be one of the zillions of people in a kind of humdrum and routine job? Because that's the reality of society as it's currently structured, then of course we end up seeing ourselves as humdrum, stuck in a routine, and at a loss to find personal meaning in our lives. We mustn't let ourselves be defined purely by the method that we use to obtain income. Yes, I'm Dave Bull, who makes and publishes woodblock prints, but in reality, printmaking is only one aspect of my interactions with society. I am much more than a printmaker. Just as you are, if you will realize it, much more than a student or a doctor or insurance agent, whatever it is that you do for a job. As a kind of offbeat analogy here, think about one of those old traveling theater companies back in the old days. I don't think they still exist. They would set up a tent somewhere in town with a stage and seating, and they'd put on a bunch of plays, Shakespeare, melodrama, whatever. There would actually only be a few people in the company, and during the evening you would see the same people in many different roles. Somebody might have been taking tickets out front before the show. Then he would appear as a king in one scene. Then after moving off stage, would do a quick change of costume and reappear as a soldier, and then again as somebody else. Each person in that company wore many hats and played many roles. Now hold on to that idea for the next few minutes. I'm going to describe a number of roles that a typical person, you, me, typical person plays in the ongoing theatrical production that is our time on this planet. Every single aspect of my relations with the world around me can be described this way. Let me look at a few of these roles. 5 of them should do it. I'm going to start close and then work my way outwards. It's going to take a couple of minutes, but stick with me here. We're going to use this concept to dig down to the idea that sits at the core of what I am trying to express. One of the biggest roles that many of us play at some point is to be a parent, to bring another life into being. Because humans are a species that gives birth to helpless young, our role as a parent at the beginning is defined by that biology. We have a responsibility to protect and nurture that new creature until it becomes capable of doing so for itself. Now that part is straightforward. Every creature on the planet does it as a matter of course. But because humans have language, because the parent and child can communicate with each other, can express ideas and feelings, everything changes. Parenting is no longer an automatic process, simply directed by biology and instinct. It becomes something we actively have to work at, to consciously direct. On day 1, you stand there with 100% of the control and nurturing of the child in your hands. And over the course of a couple of decades, you have to bring that percentage down bit by bit until it ends up being pretty much 0 for you and 100% in their own hands. Just when and how to adjust that slider during that long period is something that poses one of the biggest challenges we face during life. It can be very difficult to avoid creating adversarial relationships when what is necessary are flexible partnerships working together to move that slider. That couple of decades of active parenting is thus an extremely complicated role to play. And precisely because it is so complicated, striving to give our children the opportunity to flourish and enjoy the pleasures of being alive in this world, it's one of the most rewarding things we can do. If I had accomplished nothing else during my presence on this planet than the nurturing of a certain 2 young women, I think my time would still have been well spent. Now, all of us can, of course, easily understand that to be a parent involves both responsibilities and pleasures. We give and we get, and it is a very meaningful activity. But what happens when we look at it from the other side? After all, every single one of you who is listening to this presentation has been in that position. We have all been somebody's child. But is the situation of being somebody's child actually an active one? Isn't it passive, something that just happens to us? Does it make any sense to speak of roles or responsibilities when we're still a child? Well, if the recognition that we do have such a responsibility comes to us early enough while still living in the family unit, we might at that point try to behave in such a way as to make life easier for our parents. But I suspect, and this was certainly the case with me, that such recognition will simply not be present at that stage. It is only later, perhaps once we ourselves become parents, that it may begin to dawn on us that a family can be organized in such a way that everybody can pull their weight, and that the parents are not the only ones working for the children. In an older time, in an era of larger families and fewer conveniences, children were of necessity much more active participants in the management of running of family affairs than they tend to be these days. Back when I was an active daddy, I felt this lack, and I tried to include my 2 daughters in the management of our family, not only giving them responsibilities, the typical kind of daily and weekly chores to do, but involving them in the decision making. One example of this, from the time that they were in elementary school, they had their own allotment of the family budget. They used this to select and purchase all their own clothing with no input from me. Now, you would need to talk to them to find out what they now think of all that in retrospect, but I firmly believe that because they had more responsibility in family affairs than their schoolmates typically had, and because they and I were never in the position of being adversaries, this gave them a richer and more meaningful family life. The next example of a role you have been assigned in society is another big one. They're all big ones. The role of being somebody's partner. It's the biggest one in our lives, isn't it? I talked about being a parent as being our closest relationship, but actually the vividly active period of being a parent isn't all that long when compared with a typical lifespan these days. My mother spent 25 or so years actively tending to her 3 children, but over 75 years with her partner, my dad. Part of the problem when discussing this one is that in recent years, specifically during my lifetime, the ground rules for couples have dramatically changed. There was a strong consolidation of the nuclear family in the immediate post-war period, but in recent years we've seen this crumble under the pressures of vast social change. So it becomes difficult to know what the norms are to be a couple for life, as with my parents, or to have a few different partners over the years, as was my pattern. So rather than try and nail down a specific example as being a model, it's far more sensible to fall back on basic principles, ways of thinking and behaving that are applicable no matter what the current pattern looks like. How to behave and how to treat that person, an equal partner, in such a way as to create and maintain a truly meaningful relationship. It comes down to one key point: to be as empathetic as possible. If that's there, a good understanding of what the other person is thinking and feeling, then you will be giving when that is required and receiving when that is required. It shouldn't actually be so difficult except for one little detail. We're all, of course, empathetic to some level, and we're all considerate at some level, but to expect that 2 individuals from different backgrounds would match up exactly in their way of thinking here is simply not likely. The only way forward is for both partners to come in with a flexible and friendly approach, providing the best foundation for navigating life together through all the obstacles and problems that are inevitably going to come at you over the years. I myself look on the 3 close partnerships I've had as being very important in having shaped me into the person I am today. Without having met those women and without having those experiences, truly my life would have been far less meaningful. Okay, what's the next role to investigate as we move wider? We reach the point where we arrive at the interface between the private and the public. There's really an interesting kind of paradox about human beings, the balance between the individual and the social. Our cities can look just like an anthill or a beehive, and although we are obviously not the mindless cloned automatons that insects are, we are pretty clearly social, and yet we are just as clearly individuals. Each of us lives alone here inside this box. The interface between the two most sharply lies in our dealings with a certain group of outsiders, people who are not part of our direct family and yet who are important to us. And this is our friends and co-workers. It is the time we spend with these people, the activities we share together. These are the threads that weave us into that big fabric. These are our literal connections to the outside society. And it is in the nature of things that these connections are a two-way affair. We listen, we learn, we download, we recharge. And all the time it's flowing both ways. We tell, we share, we upload, and our own energies flow through these threads out into the social fabric, changing it, growing it, strengthening it. Okay, this last one of these little roles here is a typical person's relationship to society. It's not going to be as straightforward as the previous bits. I'm sitting here in Tokyo, and you're watching this probably from somewhere else. And the customs for community interactions, both written and unwritten, are going to be very, very different. I learned about community in Japan just days after moving to this country and renting an apartment. There was a knock on the door. It turned out to be one of the local housewives, and she was the current leader of our neighborhood community association. The leadership rotates once a year among members of each local group. She passed us the current package of information on the town, the guidebook that outlined where everything was, the library, town offices, sports center, health center, all that stuff. And she put our name and contact information into her list of members. And from then on, once every couple of weeks or so, we would receive the rotating clipboard with information on upcoming activities, events, festivals, you name it. We would read this, take note of whatever was relevant to us, and then pass it on to the next member. In our case, it was the people in the next door apartment. Now, I have no idea how such an organization might be applicable or not to some automobile-centric, far-flung suburb of LA, but here in Japan, with communities being so close-knit, it works great. We got so much benefit from this. Friendships, information, fun participation in any number of activities, and yes, on the other side of the coin, we ourselves put in plenty of effort to help keep our community alive and well. I'm a woodblock printmaker, so I carved some printing blocks for the annual Culture Festival activities. I have a white beard, so I was corralled into wearing a Santa Claus suit for Christmas parties at a daycare center. Me? Santa Claus? For them, it was the beard that was important. Funny, they don't care at all about my lack of a belly. And of course, we took part in the community cleanups. This is funny. In recent years, since we've opened our shop in Asakusa, we've had many chances to meet with visitors from overseas, many of whom eagerly tell us about their impressions of Japan. And I tell you, it must be 99% of them that start with the same thing. Oh, it's so wonderfully clean everywhere you go. Yes, ma'am, it is indeed pretty clean here. Because me and my neighbors and the local people in every community in this country get out there with our brooms and our mops and make it happen. And no, it's not chore, it's pleasure. Living in a well cared for environment is a matter of, is it pride or just a source of quiet satisfaction? Well worth the small amount of work it takes to make it happen. Okay, rolls. We've been getting wider and wider and wider. Where to call it a day? Now, these networks, our interactions with society, they don't stop at the end of the local street. The governance of our city, the country, the caretaking of our planet, these are all, of course, part of this as well. But I've kind of let this presentation get a bit out of control. I started this segment with the idea of trying to express the fundamental importance of our relationships with people all around us at all these different levels and layers. The importance of what we give, what we supply, how we affect and change things, while all the time we, of course, are being affected and changed by everything everybody else is doing. And this has been going on non-stop since the moment of our birth. But even though I've talked and talked and talked, I still haven't managed to concisely make my point. Language is failing me here. I can't find a word for the thing that I'm trying to express. In each of these roles that I've been talking about, I spoke about having responsibilities, but that word doesn't encompass what I'm trying to say. Duty. I have a duty to be a good father to my children. The sentence makes sense, but duty, responsibility, these all seem to be too much one way. I give. Obligations. I have an obligation to be a good member of my community. All of these things make this thing sound like a chore. You must do these things. Shut up and get to it. Dave, work hard. Be a good member of society. That's your meaning in life. This is not the concept I'm struggling to express. What word would you use to describe when you breathe? Breathe in and breathe out. Obligation? Well, yes, it's obligatory. Don't do it and you die. But we wouldn't use that word for it. Do you get what I'm struggling to express? All these things that we're involved with, all these threads and connections that tie us to the other members of our society, maintaining these connections, nurturing them, being part of these webs, they're not duties or obligations. This is the core, basic, essential functions of any human being of society. These connections are what our life is about. Okay, I have an idea. Maybe this analogy will help. Remember a few minutes ago, I talked about, what did I say? A seed falls to the ground and a tree is born. That seed knew what to do. Grow. Make yourself big. So it did. It grew, lived its life as a tree, and at some point died and fell over. Just another tree. Another tree among billions of trees. But just think of all the interactions that tree had during its life. how many other creatures, bacteria, bugs, birds, how many creatures were able to live and thrive in, on, and around that tree? It's uncountable. How was the climate in that area affected by the presence of that community of trees, that forest? Hugely. How about the soil? How was the soil affected? The water in the streams that were fed from that mountainside, the fish in the nearby sea. The list goes on and on and on. And it wasn't even all happening just in that immediate environment. In the case of a tree like that, the effects of its life have a global reach. Where did the oxygen come from in that breath you took just a moment ago? You know where. Each and every living thing on this planet is networked like this, including me, and of course, including you. The meaning in our lives is in our interactions with society around us, with the ecosystem around us. Some chunk of it, yes, it'll of course be in your job, the thing we do in exchange for money, but every one of us has so many other roles to fill on this stage. Some are chosen willingly by ourselves, some simply present as part of our existence in society. This is where you find the meaning in your life. It's right there in everything you're connected to. You just have to recognize it. Own these roles. Drink them in. Live them. And if you do so with enough vigor and energy and enjoying it all as you go along, then it will be completely irrelevant to you to spend any time at all worrying about the meaning of life or in what comes next. We know where we end up once our time has come to an end. The light goes out and our molecules get dispersed back into the environment for the next generation of creatures to use. There's no destination. It's all about taking our turn in this hugely interesting drama, being produced for the benefit of no audience, just for the performers on the magnificent and glorious stage that is this planet of ours. It's been really interesting for me trying to organize my thoughts to present this to you. And honestly speaking, I have no idea at all whether or not I've been able to verbalize this in an understandable way. I think the most I can expect is that my ramblings here this evening have perhaps provided some stimulus for you to think about these things for yourself or in discussion with friends. There's one last kind of funny aspect to all this, to me sitting here and explaining all this to you. If I've got all this figured out so well, then how did I do along the way? Was I so good at parenting that my 2 children grew up to be geniuses who are transforming the world? Did those 3 ladies I lived with enjoy having such a perfect partner? I'm not going to answer these rhetorical questions, but there is a point in asking. I've played some roles fairly well, I think, and others less so. They don't give us instruction manuals at the beginning. We live and learn as we move along. But I definitely think that by spending time thinking about these issues and some of the questions I posed back at the beginning, I've become comfortable with all this. I'm having a ton of fun every day. I like the people who are around me. I'm contributing to my society, and I'm happy here in my own skin. It's my fervent wish that you can be able to say the same. I think that's enough for now. Thank you very much for listening, and good night. Till next time.